group members are Aaron, Alan, and Anthony. We are going to present a research topic on identifying risk and mitigating disruptions in the automotive supply chain, which was published by the Institute for Operational Research and Management Sciences. In this presentation, we are going to talk about the problem within the traditional method of the disruption risk assessment for operational disruption and trying to analyze the new model for access to the operational disruption risk and the implementation of the new model at Ford Motor Company. The research was conducted by a group of people from some prestigious institutions like MIT, Cornell, and by some of the employees from Ford Motor Company. There, David Schmidt-Levy from MIT, William Schmidt from Cornell University, Yihua Wei from Duke University, Peter Yun Zhang from MIT, and Kate Combs, Yaogi Oleguskin, Michael Sanders, and Don Jing from Ford Motor Company. So beforehand, let's discuss some of the keywords that are very essential to the research article. You might be very familiar with some of the words, but they actually play a very important role in helping you understand the article better. For example, risk management. It means the continuous process of identifying, analyzing, and controlling threat through the mitigation and prevention procedures. Automotive. It means pertaining to the manufacturing, operation, or sale of the automobiles. Manufacturing industry. It is commonly known as the branch of the economy that is concerned with the processing of raw material into commercial products. Risk exposure index is a concept raised in this article about a method that enables a business to concentrate mitigation resources on the most important suppliers and areas of risk. Disruption. It is a very common word. It means a disturbance or problem that interrupts an event, activity, or process, some problem that can cause an activity to be unable to continue its normal way. Moving on, supply chain. It is a sequence of process involved in the production and distribution of a commodity. Mitigation. It means the action of reducing the severity, seriousness, or painfulness of something. Time recovery model. It is the new model that we're going to discuss in this research article. It considers the supply chain as a graph representing the movement of supplier parts from each supplier facility to each of the firm facilities and product lines. Time to survive model is another new model that brought up in this article. It is the maximum amount of time the system can function without performance loss if a particular node is disrupted. So what kind of problem they are trying to solve here in this article? First, the current and traditional method that most companies are using right now is called the Legacy Operational Disruption Risk Assessment Method, which actually requires firms to identify the probability and significance of any disruption risk in the early analysis process. This was very unlikely for managers to see coming at such early stages. In fact, the probability for such disruptive event to occur is quite low, but once it happens, it can cause a huge impact on the company. For example, our research paper mentioned that Ford Motor Company maintains more than 50 plants worldwide that annually utilize 35 billion parts to produce 6 million cars and trucks every single year. However, in 2011, the Thailand floods caused a huge loss to Ford by idling one of the four most profitable product lines. The scale and dynamic nature of the supply chain in big companies like Ford make it extremely hard for managers to predict the coming of such disruptive events, and it's hard for them to conduct a more insightful analysis for such disruption events. And secondly, there is not enough transparency in supply chain, especially in supply chain under in some lower tiers within the supply chain. It is stated in the article that, quote, suppliers to the industry have historically been reluctant to provide the automotive supply manufacturer with detailed information about their suppliers and their suppliers' suppliers, unquote. And therefore, it makes it even harder for a manager to collect enough data for analysis and prediction, even though they usually have good information in Tier 1 suppliers, which eventually leads to the misallocation of resources where very little preparation is done when disruptive event occur. And now I'll pass it over to Aaron. He'll discuss the significance of these issues.
Now, why are these problems important for Ford? As Zhejiang explained, operational and supply chain risks can have a damaging impact on a company's financial performance. This is particularly true for a large company such as Ford, which operates a complex global network of 50 manufacturing plants with hundreds of thousands of suppliers. The suppliers are divided into 10 tiers, 1 through 10, with 1 being the suppliers that are closest and most important to Ford's operations. They provide 35 billion parts, including 130,000 parts that are unique to Ford models, in order to produce 6 million cars and trucks annually for sale. Each of the suppliers provide a crucial component that combine to create the finished product for Ford. Ford is dependent on each of them. Thus, any disruption in Ford's extensive supply chain can have global consequences for the company. To illustrate this importance, we can take a look at previous disruption during the 2011 Thailand floods. The flooding caused one of Ford's second-tier suppliers to be unable to produce a very important part for one of Ford's most profitable car models at the time. The halt in the supply's production forced Ford to idle global production for the car model, which was a significant downturn for the company's yearly financial performance. We see that a disruption for one supplier in one region had global consequences that Ford could not effectively mitigate because they did not properly understand the risk beforehand. Other automotive firms, such as Ford's competitors Toyota and Honda, were similarly impacted as they lost thousands of units of production to the flooding. As one can see, the cost of failure is huge for Ford and other companies, as it will result in them being unable to effectively match supply with demand, leading to lost revenues. Thus, Ford must have a good understanding of the various risks it faces in its extensive supply chain. Understanding how to judge which disruptions will have the greatest impact on the firm's performance will allow Ford to minimize the financial repercussions of a disruption and determine which areas in the supply chain require more mitigation investments and which areas require less, leading to optimization. Now that we know how important this problem is, Ford needs a solution. Alan will explain now how the researchers went about implementing their solution at Ford.
So how did the researchers handle this newfound knowledge of how to deal with disruptions in the supply chain? It was done by switching Ford's legacy approach to something called the Risk Exposure Index. This index applies to any industry. Essentially, the index accounts for the fact that managers have limited ability and data to predict low probability, high impact risks, especially those risks that would affect suppliers on lower levels of the supply chain. It accounts for this by correlating the impact of a disruption to be dependent on duration rather than cause. The index also recognizes that companies' mitigation actions are typically unchanging in response to supply chain disruption, even if the disruption itself differs, which proves that the legacy method was inferior. To alleviate these concerns, the researchers implemented 2 models based on the index. The first is the time to recover model, which, as its name suggests, measures how long it would take for a supply chain to achieve stable operations again after a disruption has occurred. The model is highly versatile and can measure disruptions in terms of things like profit margin, lost production units, or even sales. This model is achieved by minimizing the constraints of linear optimization in an attempt to find the smallest impact for each disruption scenario, which is called the performance impact, also known or abbreviated as PI. So on this slide, you can see the linear optimization models I mentioned earlier. Time to recover has one model for the single-tier supply chain and one for multi-tier supply chains. The basic premise of both models is that, given a supply chain structure disruption scenario, we determine how to allocate the firm's remaining resources to optimize its ability to satisfy external demand. Allow me to start with the single tier, on the left side. Although the single tier model explicitly captures only the last tier of the production system, it can be used to analyze a disruption at a supplier in an upstream tier. All of these variables are nodes, components or a manufacturing process at a particular supplier or assembly site. The equation we're trying to minimize is the summation of all Fj, which is the performance impact, like the profit margin of one unit of product J, and Lj, which is the lost production volume of a vehicle type. This is done through a series of constraints. The first constraint is the summation of the product produced at the supply chain and the product lost at the supply chain during a disruption. This quantity must be greater than the excess supply at the supply chain. The second constraint is merely saying the amount of product J produced at plant I must be less than the total production capacity of node I per unit at time. And the final node is saying that obviously this model will only work if there are units produced and units being lost. If there are no units being made or no units being lost, the company doesn't even have a problem to begin with. Now let's move on to the second part of the slide, which is the multi-tier model. The fourth and fifth constraints of the multi-tier model are identical to that of the single tier. Some differences include that the first constraint represents total production quantity of nodes I during time t to the n minus the maximum amount of j that can be produced, given the aggregated supply of type k materials from upstream nodes in pjk. The second constraint limits the total outflow of node I to be less than the sum of production ui and inventory si, at the current location being examined. The third constraint is the disruption constraint, which limits the production of disrupted node j to be 0. The research paper summarizes these linear optimizations best when it says, quote, "The ST and MT linear programs generate prospective contingency plans that minimize the impact of the disruption on the firm's chosen performance metric. Under each disruption scenario, the optimization model generates a corresponding set of optimal values for the decision variables, denoting the best routing and resource allocation plans for that disruption." End quote. Now let's move on to the second model, time to survive. Its name is also very self-explanatory. It measures how long the firm can survive demand after the disruption meddles with its supply chain. Having a large time to survive result is good, as it means there is more room for error in the time to recover model. The opposite is obviously true, that if your time to survive is low, you should work on your supply chain immediately. Time to survive has a few key similarities and differences with time to recover. First and foremost, it is a single formula. That means it is indiscriminate in terms of how many supply chains one wishes to evaluate, unlike time to recover, which has two models. In terms of similarities, it actually uses a lot of nodes from time to recover in order to evaluate how anemic the supply chain is. The research paper explains that the constraints and variables are, quote-unquote, similar to the TTR models, except that I, t to the n, is now a decision variable in time to survive, and we do not allow any loss. Demand is strictly satisfied in the fourth constraint. Now that you understand how these formulas work, I'm going to let Anthony speak about the before and afters of the implementations of these models at Ford.
So before this risk exposure index, Ford was wasting a lot of money. They were allocating risk money to the wrong suppliers, mislabeling suppliers, and leaving large threats unprotected. A big problem was that it was spending a lot of risk money on suppliers that have a low performance impact, or PI, on its overall operations. The Risk Exposure Index allowed Ford to separate its suppliers into categories and to create risk minimizations for each one. And these categories are high spend, high PI, low spend, low PI, and low spend, high PI. And on this chart over here, you can see the results of this categorization. The y-axis indicates how much Ford is willing to spend on each supplier, and the x-axis represents the performance impact in terms of lost profits. The most troublesome area for Ford here is the area here, low spend and high PI. Now why is that? Well, these suppliers mainly fall into the most basic and crucial step of their supply chains, such as inventory and parts. Therefore, their loss would have a very high performance impact. To reduce that impact, there would have to be a number of risk minimization strategies involved, such as more locations for each supplier. However, because they are low spend and Ford doesn't spend money on them, they can't adequately cover their needs. After Ford's implementation of the REI, Ford found their risk allocation efficiency to be vastly improved. They identified 2,600 new Tier 1 supplier sites that could cost the firm, if adversely affected, up to $2.5 billion in lost profits. 1,500 of those sites had previously been written off as low exposure or low risk. In addition, Ford was able to reclassify 400 sites from high exposure or high risk to low exposure and pull risk resources out from those suppliers. This allowed them to reallocate those funds to sites that needed it and improve overall efficiency. And on this chart here, you can see all of Ford's suppliers, now given a value with the risk exposure index. The size of the circles represents the magnitude of the possible damage, and the table below goes into detail of all the different types of impacts on each supplier. So given now all of our research on Ford's risk exposure index, we have to come up with several key takeaways based on our findings. First up is Alan and his results.
In terms of my takeaway, since I primarily covered the models, and I'm currently finishing my capstone math minor in linear algebra, I was reminded of one of the uses of the Monte Carlo method, which is an array of algorithms that are used to approximate aggregations of inputs that fall within a domain. The models reminded me of this, since we're using all these different constraints to reach the sweet spot where the firm knows exactly which supply chains cannot keep up with the capacity and how far behind or how affected they are. The article also made me realize that companies really rely on costs to determine which location is best for them to produce in. However, I believe instead companies should prioritize locations that are not privy to such disruptions, since in the long run it can save costs and headaches. For example, although Thailand got flooded, maybe New Zealand doesn't have that problem. It would be a better site for a factory, even though it might be more expensive. Speaking of expensive, with the recent president-elect's harsh rhetoric towards foreign production, I am wondering if these models can be used to evaluate whether isolationism is truly better for America, since most of the mainland US has suitable real estate for factories and often don't face natural disasters like earthquakes or floods. Over the course of the next 4 years, we'll be able to see what is best for both the corporate community and the economies and environments of the world. Now Aaron will share his thoughts on the matter.
The major lesson that I see throughout this research is the increasing importance and power of technology to allow companies to solve problems and make operations more efficient than ever before. There are two major trends shown through this research. One is that globalization is increasing the speed of change, which creates greater uncertainty for firms. The second is that given this increased uncertainty, there is the increased need of technology not to replace human tasks and automate them, but to augment the capabilities of workers in order to make better decisions. The authors of this research create a highly complex decision support system for Ford's management that integrated many of the company's databases, supply chain models, and data visualization software to optimize the ability of Ford to view results and plan accordingly. Technology has allowed Ford to fight the problem of low probability, high impact disruptions head on effectively, which the firm could not do before. With the proliferation of global markets, Ford cannot just perform well in US markets or European markets if they desire to continue to be a top firm. They have made efforts to optimize their resources in order to perform well in Asian markets, Brazilian markets, and in any market where there is valuable demand for Ford's automobiles. This type of competitive advantage that Ford has built will be necessary for other automakers to invest in and adopt going forward. Given my thoughts, Anthony would like to share his takeaway on the researchers' solutions.
Thank you, Aaron. So Ford's implementation of the REI is useful for determining which suppliers are low risk, but it should also be taken a step further and be used to reduce risk costs overall, even if it means less profits in the short run. What Ford needs to do now is to take their newly classified high exposure sites and turn them into low exposure ones. Doing so would certainly increase expenses and decrease profits in the short run, but in the long run, these sites would be able to function with greater safety and greater efficiency. One example would be to ship factories from Thailand, a place more disaster prone, to Ohio, which is less risky. In that case, In the case of some of these factories are critical nodes within the supply chain, for example, factories that apply finishes and paints to completed cars, it is important to implement supermarket model line number 2, which would decrease waiting time and risk. While yes, building a second factory and incurring expenses also means tagging along additional risk, overall it diversifies the total risk across more factories and allows for a higher return, a similar concept to the diversification of portfolios of stocks within finance. By taking steps to reduce risk, Ford would surely have to take some hits to the belt for the near future. But in the long run, its profit margins will be higher and its total risk lower. More importantly, Ford will be able to divert these previously risk-allocated resources into other divisions such as R&D, new model lines, and sustainability. Development in these areas are especially key to Ford's ability to compete in a competitive auto industry.
As the research points out, the operational disruptions are both difficult to predict and have a highly uncertain impact on performances. The 2 new models, the time to recover model and the time to survive model, highlight the importance of understanding the impact of any disruption occurred, regardless of its source. Since it's impossible to predict how and when the disruption would happen, it is more tractable to analyze the impact of that disruption and estimate a firm's vulnerability. Indeed, 2 new models help automotive companies like Ford efficiently identify and manage this high exposure risk so that the company can put all possible resources into supplier sides with material impact if a disruption occurred. However, just like Anthony pointed out, that there's more that the automotive company can do in terms of turning this high exposure size into low exposure size. As our President-elect Donald Trump states in his tax plan that he's planning to decrease the corporate tax level in order to bring American companies back to the United States from overseas. This could be an alternate way of decreasing risk involved in other nations because of natural, social, political reasons. If Ford could move many of its supplier sites, which would have a very high impact on performances, if any time disrupted, back to the United States, that will largely decrease the risk involved.
Time to recover model has one model for the single tier. The models reminded me of this since we're all using these different constraints to reach this sweet spot where the firm knows exactly which supply chains cannot keep up with capacity and how far behind or how exactly. Wow, okay, alright.
Are these problems important for Ford? He's... Go, let's go. Okay. Now, supply chain can have global consequences. Ford's second. Oh, goddamn, that stuff. Now, why are these problems important for Ford? Operational and supply chain risks can have a damaging impact on a company's finance of suppliers. That's a test one. Oh, okay, that's one.
By taking steps. After Ford's implementation of the REI, Ford found their risk allocation efficiency to be vastly improved. They identified 26. Thank you, Aaron. Ford's implementation of the Thank you, Aaron. So Ford's implementation of the REI is useful for determining which ones are not only low risk, but which suppliers. Man, this supplier is not definitely full. You can tell me that.